Hello, I'm Gianni Κουτσομύτη, and we're here at the Delphi Economic Forum, and I'm happy to have here with me for a quick chat Pieter Spígyel, who's a legend of the Greek crisis, a veteran.
It's
Hello,
very
Peter.
very good to be here. Very good to be back in Greece.
Thank you, thank you. You had a great conversation yesterday with the Vice President of the ECB and the Central Banker of Cyprus, and there were some interesting aspects there. What's your take on what ECB now is up to, and how Fed and the European central banks are joining forces now to combat inflation and possible recession fears? The Germany, the UK, and the States.
Well, I'll tell you, the thing I found most interesting about that discussion, and then there was a subsequent discussion with the heads of two of the big Greek banks, was actually a discussion about the financial system. Because obviously in the US in March, we went through a bit of a scare with two banks failing. We have another one that's on the verge of failure, First Republic. And both the conversation with the central bankers and the conversation with the heads of the two Greek banks really focused on financial stability. And what was remarkable to me was that unlike previous crises, there were American banks and then obviously the Swiss banks, but the Eurozone banks thus far have really escaped things. And I think de Guindos's comments about why that was, I thought were really telling. Now he said, look, they think they've done the hard work post-crisis to clean up the balance sheets and that they're in a safe position. But he was still very nervous because of what happened, particularly at Silicon Valley Bank, which is a combination of, as he put it, the ability to move money very quickly. You know, you don't have to go to a branch anymore to take your money out. So basically a bank run occurred electronically, instantaneously you take your money out, combined with social media, which really lit the fire. There were people on social media saying, oh my God, this bank is going down. Everyone moved their money out. And he said, look, I think the Eurozone banks are safe, but a combination like that no bank is safe from that. And it was very interesting to me to hear that. The panel I participated in, it was actually the one with the two heads of the banks. They made similar noises. They were very confident that they're secure to avoid any headwinds, particularly from rising interest rates. They have a different deposit base and whatnot. But I think there is an underlying concern watching what has happened to the U.S. banks. That are the regulatory tools in place to safeguard banks in the modern environment. So I think for me, the most interesting takeaway was on the banking sector and the financial sector. Now you mentioned monetary policy. I mean, the interesting thing there, as you said, is, well, look, there's global inflation, particularly in the developing world, in the US and in Europe. The inflation is worse in the US. The Fed has moved quicker and more aggressively. And I don't think we're going to see the Fed cut anytime soon. I know the markets are thinking that there's going to see cuts by the end of the year as the economy slows down. The ECB has moved less aggressively. The inflation problem here is a little bit less acute, so that's why. But I think this is going to be the major issue going forward in the next 6 to 12 months. In elections, in economic policy making, the inflation that we're seeing now is so different, I think, from traditional inflationary cycles because it was triggered by the pandemic. A huge shift in people's spending from services to goods. We all remember the sight of ships unable to park at the port of Los Angeles and the shortages of microchips and frankly to the general supply chain disruption. And that is a feature of a inflationary spike that we haven't seen before. So there still is an issue about whether there are these temporary things that will work their way out and whether policymakers at the Fed and the ECB can bring inflation down to control, which I think they will be able to. But my view on that one is somewhat in the minority. I think there are a lot of people who believe that this is more problematic.
What significant factor in all this cycle is China.
Yes.
And China is going to come back to growth and how it's going to implement these policies in the global sphere. We've seen Xi Jinping talking to Zelensky, which was...
Hadn't done before.
Yes. How do you see China now engaging both with the Europeans vis-a-vis Macron and these awkward comments we saw during his visit there, and his Xi Jinping's relation to Putin, special relationship? How do we deal with that?
So look, I think there's two things going on here. One, and this started frankly this year at Davos, where the Chinese showed up and said, "We're here to do business with you." And to me, it very much appeared as a charm offensive to the Europeans because they knew the tensions with the Americans were not going to be resolved anytime soon. So can we peel the Europeans off through economic dialogue? And that had continued for some time and frankly derailed a little bit, if you remember last week when the Chinese ambassador to Paris made these remarks on television where he said former Soviet republics aren't really sovereign states. Not a nice thing to say to the Latvians, the Lithuanians, and the Estonians. So that engendered a bit of EU backlash. It was interesting to me that the call with Zelensky was right after that.
He was rebuked from the Chinese Foreign Ministry.
He was rebuked from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, and then she calls Zelensky. And to me, you can't take those two things separately. I think clearly Beijing was upset by those remarks. I think the remarks from the Foreign Ministry reflect that. And I think the effort to play nice with the Ukrainians was also part of that. Now, look, I think in some ways Xi is trying to position himself as an honest broker between the Ukrainians and the Russians. I don't think Washington is going to accept that, and I suspect most of Europe won't accept that because of what you just said, which is that relationship with Putin. The one thing strategically that the U.S. and the West has that China doesn't have is allies, right? There is a treaty alliance in NATO. The U.S. also has treaty allies in Asia with Japan and Korea and Australia. The Chinese don't have that. Right now, though, they have Russia. It's their only really powerful ally. Despite the fact they have done things that I think the Chinese would rather them not do in Ukraine, they are not going to abandon the Russians. And I think the view out of Washington and most European capitals is the Chinese are not a trusted interlocutor here. It's good that he called Zelensky. It shows the Chinese are coming into the conversation in a positive manner, but I don't think anyone believes the Chinese can enter here and be an honest broker.
You've been a veteran of the Greek crisis. I remember all those glorious, inglorious days back in 2012, 2015. How do you see Greece coming out of this crisis? It's a different country now, I think, but I want your personal view of that.
Well, look, I think it's very much a tale of two economies. There is, in many ways, I think Mitsotakis, and to a certain extent, tail end of Tsipras, should get some credit for wrapping up the crisis, for lack of a better word. I mean, this went on for far too long. Let's be honest, exacerbated by the first year of the Varoufakis Tsipras government. But by the end of the Tsipras government, he did his kalatumba and had returned Greece to the markets. Mitsotakis has inherited that and done a very good job in stabilizing the economy, attracting foreign investment, attracting domestic investment. So the numbers look very good right now. But I think a couple of things we need to remember is that the economy is still smaller than it was before the crisis, which means people are poorer.
Yes.
So although the economy is doing better, most Greeks, particularly working class Greeks, are still suffering and they're still poorer than they were 10 years ago. And also, the inflationary pressures contribute to that, right? So if you are either working class or poor, you've seen your wealth go down and now you've seen inflation go up. So you have two pictures here. You have a stabilized economy, which makes Greece look much more like a normal Eurozone country, like in Italy or Spain. But you still have the lasting effects of the crisis, which means the country is poorer, and so when an inflation spike happens, it impacts Greece more than it probably does most other Eurozone countries.
Index of purchase power index for Greece is very low.
Very low.
People now we're in pre-election time, and even Mitsotakis, who's an outspoken liberal, he's talking about rising wages and all that stuff like a social democrat. So the ideology has shifted away from a strictly liberal talk.
It has,
about
although
helping these people.
We know that Mitsotakis has always come from a bit more the moderate wing of New Democracy, and I think he's attracted a lot of the old PASOK voter and a lot of the old PASOK even officials who abandoned PASOK when they fell apart have gone to his side. So he does have people in his ear talking about that. I think also it's quite an effective way of undermining the opposition when they say he doesn't care about the poor. He has been much more socially liberal in some of these policies. So yes, what has been remarkable about Mitsotakis is I think when he came in, people were skeptical about his ability to lead a party that is very diverse and sometimes divisive. You have on the right, very nationalist wing of the party that frankly did in his sister, if you remember, with Dora Bakoyannis. And he came from the more, I always call it the New York liberal Republicans. It's more the pro-business part of the party. But he's been pretty effective at being able to hold those parts together, even through the Ukraine crisis. Again, I wasn't covering Greece at the time. I moved back to New York. But when I saw Mitsotakis come out and be very vocal in his support of Ukraine, I thought, ooh, that's actually a relatively bold decision because I know the historical ties, religious, cultural, with Greece and Russia, but he's been able to come out pro-Ukraine and not really have any disruption in the right wing of his party. So I think he's been able to do many things that I think we were skeptical of him being able to do when he became prime minister.
And also the handling of the pandemic and the crisis was quite effective.
That's right.
Do you think that the scandal with wiretapping is going to affect his image worldwide? Do you hear that in the States or in other capitals you visit?
So I do think it has an impact. I think that and the other thing, obviously, which undermines his credibility as a technocratic do-gooder or a capable, competent leader is the train crash as well. Those are two things. If he has an international reputation as a competent, detail-oriented leader, how do you explain the fact that he claims he didn't know about the wiretapping and then the train crash? And I think that has undermined somewhat his standing domestically, but certainly internationally as well. I think what's been surprising to me is that the phone tapping thing has gotten somewhat more attention abroad than here domestically. And that's partially because that has been this issue of these technologies that are able to tap into phones has become an international incident, and Greece is part of that story now. So I think that's going to be the interesting thing to watch in the election. I think you have a prime minister, as you said, handled the pandemic well compared to his European and Western counterparts, an economy that's going in the right direction, although with some caveats. And then at the tail end of his term, these two scandals, which really I think has dented his popularity domestically, but also his standing abroad. And I think that's what's
he apologized for the train trade. Yeah.
He did. And you know, I think we've seen his poll numbers drop, but in talking to some of his people, or not his people necessarily, but people around him who know his thinking, what I have heard is he thinks that by apologizing, acknowledging his role, even though this is something that's been going on for years, he hopes the Greek people will understand that this is he will take responsibility when he has to. So it'll be interesting to see.
Last question: Turkey election 1 week before Greece.
Yeah.
And Mr. Erdogan fell ill a day or two ago. So we have question mark there. How do you see that developing?
So I've been somewhat surprised when I talked to Greek officials this week about how many believe that he could lose. I am somewhat skeptical. I think he is still the singular figure in Turkish politics, and much of what he has done as, let's be honest, an autocrat in Turkey has stacked the deck in his favor. But you're right, the earthquake wasn't good. The recent health developments raised a lot of questions. It is, I guess, possible that he could lose. I would say my view and my betting right now is that he wins re-election. And there is always a conversation about, okay, once Erdogan gets past the elections, does he become more reasonable? Can he be dealt with? I'm very skeptical. So I am skeptical about security issues in the Eastern Mediterranean, whether Mitsotakis will be able to, if he wins re-election, or whoever the Greek leader is, will they be able to engage with Erdogan on issues of sovereignty and borders and whatnot? I'm very skeptical on that. There are all number of issues. Cyprus, I mean, there was a window several years ago where it looked like there could have been a deal there, which Erdogan decided he didn't want to play ball on. NATO, Sweden, he is blocked. So there are any number of issues that both Greeks and the West need to work with Erdogan on. And there is a general view that perhaps after the election, he will have more room to maneuver. I am skeptical. I do not believe that Erdogan is someone you can work with. I think he's always looking for domestic gain, political and economic, and so I am somewhat skeptical. If there's a different government, all bets are off. But my base case is Erdogan wins,
He will be
and it's a status quo ante.
Peter, thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.
Thank you for talking with us at the Delphi Economic Forum.
Thank you for having me.
Hope to see you next year.
Absolutely.
Bye.